Okay, so the other thing that we need to know about the heart is something called the hemoglobin dissociation curve. So, hemoglobin is how we carry our oxygen, and every hemoglobin consists of 4 polypeptide chains. Okay, because it has a quaternary structure, and each one of those polypeptide chains can carry 1 oxygen molecule. So a hemoglobin dissociation curve just shows us how saturated hemoglobin is as we increase in partial pressure. So this is the amount of oxygen that's available in the atmosphere, and then that would be how much your hemoglobin would be saturated per each partial pressure. So obviously, the less partial pressure, the less oxygen available, the less saturated, and the more oxygen available, the more saturated. But you see, it follows this, what we call an S-shaped curve, okay, until we get to the maximum of 100%. So this S-shaped curve happens because the hemoglobin, in the beginning, it binds to 1 oxygen molecule on one of the polypeptide chains, which can happen quite slowly when there's very little oxygen available. But then as the 1 binds, it causes the protein structure to shift, and when it shifts, it exposes the other heme groups to bind to oxygen easier. So then you start to get this sharp increase with not a huge increase in partial pressure, because then the second oxygen is much easier to bind, and the third one is even easier, and then the fourth one. So it rapidly rises compared to in the beginning because of that shifting in the protein structure, making it easier for the next one to bind. So that's how oxygen binds with our hemoglobin, and that forms oxyhemoglobin. Now the other thing that happens is carbon dioxide also needs to get carried in the blood because you need to breathe it out because it's a waste product. So carbon dioxide is carried in the following ways. Okay, 5% as plasma, 10% as carbaminohemoglobin, meaning it binds to hemoglobin just like oxygen does, and 85% as what we call hydrogen carbonate ions. So now those come because when carbon dioxide goes into the blood plasma consists mostly of water, and carbon dioxide can bind to water with the help of an enzyme that sits in the hemoglobin molecule, and that enzyme is called carbonic anhydrase. And now that enzyme takes that and binds it together. And when it does that, you get H2CO3, which is called carbonic acid. So it makes carbonic acid. And then carbonic acid dissociates, meaning it breaks apart. And that H2CO3 can break up into H plus ions and HCO3 minus ions. So those H plus ions are called hydrogen ions. And HCO3 minus are my hydrogen carbonate ions. Another word for that is bicarbonate ions. So this is where majority of the carbon dioxide is carried back to the lungs. But now, hydrogen ions are responsible for pH. So the more hydrogen ions there are, the more acidic something is, and it lowers the pH. So if you're creating a large amount of carbon dioxide, so for example, you're exercising a lot and your body is producing a lot of carbon dioxide as a product of respiration, you're going to make a lot of hydrogen ions. So now that is going to lower the blood pH, and your body doesn't want that. So to prevent that from happening, you have something called the bohr shift occurring. because the body wants to maintain the pH. So in order to get rid of the pH, it's going to shift this curve because hemoglobin can pick up hydrogen ions. And when hemoglobin picks up hydrogen ions, it makes something called HHB, hemoglobinic acid. So now hemoglobinic acid then doesn't affect the pH because now we mopped up all those hydrogen ions. But in order to do that, the hemoglobin gets rid of the oxygen and only picks up these hydrogen ions. So this whole curve has to shift because now it's going to take a whole lot more partial pressure of oxygen to reach the same saturation. So this curve shifts over to the right-hand side. It starts in the same place and it ends in the same place. But this moves over to the right, and that is then the Bohr shift that we have. Because of all the excess hydrogen ions that we don't want to affect our blood pH.